Hello, viewers. My name's Alan Bilton, and it's my great honour to welcome you tonight to the latest of Swansea University's Cultural Institute's Literary Salon series. I have to admit that when I first misread the email, I thought it said Literary Saloon. So I was going to appear with Stetson hats, leather chaps. Maybe I am wearing leather chaps, but that's a whole nother website, it must be said. So instead, it's my very great pleasure and honour to introduce Carole Hailey to you tonight. And Carole is the author of the brilliant Book of Jem. And obviously, as both her PhD supervisor and as her co-publisher, I say that with no bias whatsoever. But it's a tremendous book. It's Carole's first novel. She's also been shortlisted for the International Bridport Prize. And she's also a London Library Emerging Writer of 2021, both of which are extremely impressive literary accomplishments. So tonight, Carole and I are going to be talking about her new novel, The Book of Jem. If you have got any questions for Carole, then by all means, whilst we are chattering away, feel free to enter them into the Q&A slot down below, type in your questions, and then 20 minutes or so before the end, we will come to those and I will happily put them to Carole directly. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so one of the, I guess, the chief ambitions of Watermark Press was to create a home for novels that in some ways are hard to pigeonhole or hard to characterize. And I think the Book of Jem probably falls into this category. So as an opening question for Carole, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what kind of a novel, what kind of a beast we've got on our hands this evening. Carole.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I found through blood, sweat and tears, but mainly tears, when I wrote a novel previously that wasn't published, that very often if a novel doesn't fit into a category that's recognisable instantly on a bookshelf of a bookshop, it's very difficult to get it published. And this book does fall between certain gaps, I think. It is a speculative fiction novel. That's what I would call it. Speculative fiction being a very broad category that covers sort of basically books that could be set in the real world, but really have elements or always have elements that are unreal as well. It's also sort of fits in the category of both literary fiction and commercial fiction, I think, as well. And it's dystopian, but not that dystopian. So it's a book that doesn't neatly fit into any of the sort of bookshelf categories. But really, I wrote it because I wanted to explore the idea of a world without God. And the fact that that book that I produced wasn't necessarily going to fit neatly onto a bookshelf didn't stop me from writing it.
Okay, and I'm very glad that you persevered with it. So absolutely. So you say the initial idea came from, so it's set in a society, a future society, but not very far perhaps in the future. I mean, dystopian society is, of course, just outside of our window. And the idea of a world where we're not allowed to leave and we're trapped inside whilst drones are hovering outside has perhaps caught up with us. But it began with the initial idea of a world in which all religion has been banned. You're not allowed to mention God. You're not allowed to indulge in any religious behavior. And then a mysterious prophet arrives into this small, isolated, rural community. So where did the idea come from? Why did it take this form? Why was this the best way to tell this story about religion and man's need for religion and where that might lead them in this way?
So, well, the idea came from several different things. One was actually something that happened to me whilst I, in a different life, when I was a lawyer in London. And we held, so I ran a law firm, we held a client party, and one of our clients came along. I'd never met her before, although I'd spoken to her on the phone. And she made a point of coming to introduce herself to me, which was great. And she said she had been in London to, she said she volunteered doing mental health, work with mental health, sort of a mental health organisation is what she actually said. And then I mentioned that I'd been a Samaritan, and she said, I think you know, you'd be, and that I was keen to get back into doing something like that. And she said, I think you would be great at doing this. I'll be in touch. And then she left. She didn't speak to anyone else. And the next day she began a campaign of ringing me and emailing me, and it transpired very quickly that she was a Scientologist. And it took 3 months for her to get the message that I wasn't interested in coming along to the Church of Scientology, which was just down the road from the office. And it, I was, at the time, I couldn't understand my own reaction to it, why I had such an immediate dislike of the idea of being involved with Scientology, and why that seemed to me more offensive to me than somebody sort of coming up to me in the street and asking me if I wanted to join their local sort of Christian church, which had also happened not long before that. And I was very interested in exploring the idea of why one religion might be socially acceptable or more socially acceptable than another religion. And that was the sort of genesis of the idea for this. But when I started to research Scientology more for the purposes of the PhD, thought, well, I'll invent my own religion. and I thought the best way of inventing a religion for me in a work of fiction was to imagine a world where religion wasn't allowed, and to sort of take it from there.
And I think your invented religion is actually a lot more convincing than Scientology in a strange sort of way.
Well,
so the threads and the binding, it all ties together. While Scientology, what's going on with its floating boat with the secret of a universe on, and lizards and Tom Cruise? Yours is a much more persuasive model, I think.
But I think mine's much more restrained. I mean, it was interesting. The research that I did for this book, I read so much about religions, mainly not the sort of main stalwart religions, but the more sort of on the fringe religions. And actually, I finished when I finished doing all the research and finished the book, I actually had a lot more sympathy for people who do actually sort of cling on to these religions and get something from them. Which is not to say that Scientology is necessarily something that people should be clinging to, because if they cling to Scientology, basically they'll just be emptying their wallets. And that's why that lady was interested in me joining. She thought, city lawyer, and Scientology tithes, they collect tithes. So
right, absolutely. Okay.
But anyway, yes. So there's certainly this in the Book of Jem, there is certainly some influences from what I researched about Scientology, but there are more influences from perhaps things like Mormons, and again, there's a sliding scale of acceptability with religion in society, which I think is really interesting. And I wrote, I invented a religion which I think is more acceptable than a lot of actual real life religions, yes. Even though mine's fictitious.
Well, there's a question about, and of course, Scientology, there was a long court case about whether it should be classified as a religion for tax purposes. So again, it's the bottom line that's driving all of this. But again, who gets to decide? And who gets to decide when it's genuine spiritual yearning or thinking, or whether it's delusional craziness? and that somehow the idea that there are clear divides between the two falls apart in some ways the closer you look at it. And I think that one of the many great attributes of the Book of Jem is that we're never really sure, at least at the start of the book, what we think about Jem. It's, although on the one hand, what she says sounds incredible and strange, on the other hand, there does seem to be some miraculous things going on. We're constantly wrong-footed. We're not quite sure about how to take this and how to take her. And that seems to be one of the great strengths of the book.
Well, I was keen to also explore the idea, or rather the question of who has the right to decide what the truth is of anything. In fact, does anyone have the right to decide? And is there ever really a truth? Because I think it's partly through the function of having two narrators, but there's several truths or untruths, depending on your perspective, in the Book of Jem, because there's obviously Eileen, then there's Eileen's recounting of things in her own Book of Jem, then there's Kat's recollection of things, and there's the truth that we never get to hear, which is Jem's own truth, what she thinks actually, whether she genuinely believes what she says. So there's multiple truths and also no truth at the same time, and I found that that's obviously allied to religion very closely. You know, what is true and what isn't true. And it was a very interesting question to explore, I thought, in fiction. I mean, right. I found it interesting.
It's fascinating, and of course we live in a sort of a post-truth world, as they say, and I guess political events and the way in which the argument is that truth can be spun in certain ways have created that desire that, you know, that there needs to be something we can agree on. Truth needs to be consensual. We need to agree what things are really like, and that seems to be breaking down, whether it's technology that's doing it, whether it's culture that's doing it. And your novel seems to address absolutely all those issues. So were you clear from the start that Jem wasn't going to be one of the narrators of your novel, that she was going to remain this slightly shadowy figure, either victim or slightly sinister, depending how, you know, as the novel progresses? But was that always part of it, that you were going to see things through two other sets of eyes?
Definitely. And part of the reason for that is because, and again, it comes back to the research that I did. Almost all religions start with a charismatic leader, which is the sort of sociological term for it. And the charismatic leader, almost all charismatic leaders, they're very disciplined, they're very self-controlled, and they reveal very little of their own feelings. And even the people who've sort of their followers, who've followed them for years, their closest followers actually never really know what they're thinking. And so for me, it was really important to write, in order to write a plausible religion with a plausible charismatic leader, it was really important that we did never have any insight really into Jem and her thoughts. Had we, it would have become a completely different novel, because either she would have been perceived by the reader as being having a sort of God complex, let's say, or having mental health issues possibly. And actually, I didn't want either of those things to be determined by or to be known by the reader, or indeed by the community around her. And so by making her unknowable, except by what she does, she's absolutely following in the footsteps of people like Jim Jones, who was responsible for the Jonestown massacre in Guyana in the 70s, where nearly 1,000 people took the sort of Kool-Aid. I think it was actually called Flavor Aid, but the Kool-Aid. And so he had followers that had been with him for years, but none of them really knew what he thought about anything, actually. They just followed him blindly.
Yeah, and the fact that she suddenly appears in this isolated community, cut off from everywhere else. She's very young, and yet she doesn't seem to have any discernible past. She's a kind of a blank space that people project things upon her. And there is something slightly uncanny about her. There's something quite strange about her actions and her appearance. And again, we can't simply write her off as a crazy person or see her as some type of, confidence trickster, or she's there to fool people. There is something very, very striking about her. As indeed, there's something very striking about both your narrators, who are very, very different. So it's Eileen and Kat, and Eileen is the true believer in the cult of Jem, and Kat is the skeptic. So how did you come up with the voices for those two characters, and how important were their characters to the themes of the novel?
Well, Kat's the easier one, I suppose, to talk about, in that she was always intended to be a character that readers could relate to more, I think. Not necessarily because of her disbelief in the religion. I certainly didn't want to, and I hope I haven't written a novel that's cynical about religion. It's not really supposed to be that, but she was supposed to be more relatable. She had a more sort of perhaps normal social situation. She was the reliable narrator, to use the literary term, the one that we knew would actually we could trust up to a point. I mean, only up to a point, because obviously she has very strong views about Jem that are biased, but we could trust her more. Eileen was a much more, she's, I think, a much more complex character, in that she is an archetypal, unreliable narrator, in that she has no concept, really, as she's narrating the story, of how she's perceived by the people around her. And she doesn't really have any particularly clear grasp on what's happening either. And in that regard, she was an unreliable narrator. But where she became very complex was that when she writes her Book of Jem, she's knowingly unreliable. She deliberately she both uses very, very sort of biblical language, and also she mythologizes things like the turbines and makes them giants that are tickling the clouds, and the drones become raptors, and so I used her to explore the whole idea about how any holy book is only as reliable as the person that writes it.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't have an unreliable narrator with scripture, can you? It just doesn't work. It all falls apart if you think they've missed bits out, or they've distorted bits, or they didn't like certain people, so they changed the facts. That alters how we read it.
Yes, but I think the interesting thing is that the holy books, let's take the Bible, are, for many people, they are obviously, I mean, it is scripture in every sense of the word. And yet when parts of the Bible, certainly parts of the Bible, were written, they were never written as holy books. So St. Paul, when he was writing his epistles, which are part of the Bible, St. Paul believed that Jesus was going to come back in his lifetime, in St. Paul's lifetime, and therefore the letters he wrote, he thought were just letters, and basically he was kind of urging on the believers to hang on in there, things would get better, keep doing the rituals that you're doing, and Jesus is going to come back in our lifetime, and the second coming will happen, and everything's going to, we're going to have heaven on earth. And it was only hundreds of years later, literally hundreds of years later, that a committee sat around and decided what books would be in the Bible, and they put his letters in. And so when they're read now by Christians as gospel, they were never written as such. And that was something I was very keen to explore, well, through the character of Eileen writing a book, that actually she intends her Book of Jem to stand as the holy book for God's threads in the future. And yet, even while she's writing it, she knows she's not telling the truth, which I thought was a very sort of, because that is what happens, which can bring me on to doing.
It does, almost as if we planned it that way. That would be, yes. Why not? Let's have a little reading from the text itself, from scripture from the Book of Jem, I believe.
So this is a small section from Eileen's Book of Jem, in the Book of Jem. And I'm just going to read a bit. I'm going to leave some out just for the sake of brevity. But then afterwards, I'm just going to go on for a paragraph or so where she completely undermines what she's just written in her Book of Jem. So this is, I have to bring the light round, sorry. This is Eileen's Book of Jem. Truths 6, verses 1 to 17. The prophet Jem often walked on the hills to hear the voice of God. One day she told the believers to come with her, so they followed her, and when she turned from the main path, forging a narrow track through the snow, they followed her there too. As they watched, she knelt on the ground, unconcerned by the snow or the wind or the cold. When she spoke, they were overcome by the sweetness of her voice and the beauty of her face, delicate and pale above her red scarf. Holding out her hand, she said, come close, and I will tell you the words of God." The faithful drew close, and as she spoke, her breath warmed the freezing air, and they no longer felt cold. This is what she told them. "I have come to prepare you. God has a plan for the people of Underhill." One among them called out, "Where is God? I cannot see it." And the prophet replied, "God is everywhere." When she said this, some of the people looked about fearfully, while the doubts of others were clear on their faces. But when the prophet saw their fears and their doubts, she laughed. God will reveal its plan when it knows you are ready to hear it. But first, you must begin the preparations. "Why would God choose to reveal these truths to you?" called out a faithless one. "I was of no consequence until I was chosen by God to hear its words," said the prophet. "I am but a thread like you. We are all God's threads." "But why did God send you to Underhill?" And the people continued to ask questions, and the prophet continued to answer them. The reason I finished my entry in the Book of Jem at that point was because I couldn't bring myself to write down all the ridiculous questions everyone was asking. I failed to see why it wasn't enough for some people to know that Jem was revealing God's words without having to interrogate her about the details of who, what, where, and why. I mean, just think about it for a moment. God's words were being revealed to us, to a handful of people, most of whom, let's be fair, weren't exactly worthy recipients of such a gift. I said from the outset that I was going to write a prophet book to record God's messages to Jem, and it's also important for me to include details to explain what happened to make it end like it did. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to waste space in my precious notebook writing down the inane drivel of ignorant people. If I'd asked Jem at the time, I'm sure she would have agreed that it was far more important that I captured the essence of what happened, the truth behind the truth, if you will, rather than confining myself to faithfully transcribing a series of often rather dull events as they occurred.
I love the shift in tone, absolutely. I mean, she's a brilliant comic character as well. I mean, she's a monster. She's a monstrous character, and you know, she's a bully. She's self-centered, and obviously she's out to get ownership of the church and to somehow own it and be the official scribe recording everything. But she's great. She's got a book of enemies. We've all got a book of enemies where she writes down the names of all the people who've ever said.
Here's mine. I've got one.
And you know, she's really petty. One of the questions in the Q&A is she based on somebody that you know? Well, I will assume not for legal reasons. I think that, you know, but she's a brilliant comic character as well as a quite a terrifying character in her own way. How important was the comic aspect to this? That there is a shift in tone throughout the novel, and that she's deliberately distorting, changing, settling petty scores. She's a monster, isn't she?
Well, that's one truth. Yes, I mean, I think she's definitely got sociopathic tendencies, but I also think it's a pretty grim society that I've put these people into. She lost both her parents when, well, they died when she was 16. She's got no hope of going anywhere or doing anything, and so she is a monster, but I think she's a creation of the society that I've created a monster, because I created a pretty horrific society. And she's obviously very lonely and misjudged. I think she is. She's sort of stood. The character of Eileen stood for a lot of sort of other characters that don't appear, or not very often, but that are sort of on the margins of society. And society is difficult enough, and then when the people that are pushed out to the margins, I think they perhaps have some justification for their behaviour, although possibly not for all of her behaviour, giving no spoilers away.
Indeed, things do get bleaker, and she's in love with Jem, and that's sort of clear from the start. And again,
she's in thrall. I would use the word thrall to Jem. Yeah.
But then the power relation sort of shifts a bit, and you can see Jem getting slightly worried about this, her most zealous follower and what she's doing. And I think you capture that beautifully. And you're right. I mean, she's not simply a monster. I mean, all monsters are fascinating in their own way. Donald Trump's fascinating in his own way, taking him a monstrous figure. But yes, you're right. There are reasons why she is as she is, and she's a character actually we enjoy spending time with. I think she's really funny because she's so honest about how she hates so many other people, and she's quite open about everything. She doesn't repress anything, and she is absolutely kept to the margin, staring in through the window, stealing things from people. This strange character on the outside, and we do feel sorry for her. There is a sense of pathos about her, and I think with Kat as well. With Kat, on the one hand, you're right, you might think, well, she's the one that we know. When we come to the Kat sections, it's all true. To go back to your truth analogy, we think this is a realist novel, and although it's first person, we understand. But Kat herself, although she's horrified by the threads and by this new cult, she's kind of got her own religious longing. She's got a kind of pagan belief in a tree in her garden and saying prayers to it. She's got a sense of a higher power and nature and all these things which are absolutely forbidden in your society. She secretly indulges in as well. So there is a kind of hypocrisy about Kat as well, where she says, all you crazy people, how can you believe such irrational, lunatic things? And this includes her husband, who also gets tangled up in this. Look, we're rationalists. We've got computers, we've got wind turbines. We're living in a modern age. How can you believe this stuff? But she's also got those same kind of yearnings for some meaning, some purpose, some consolation from some force outside of herself.
Yes, and I think it goes back to there's a couple of things. Firstly, she was the vehicle for exploring perhaps the idea of, my religion is acceptable, but yours isn't, which obviously, taken to the sort of nth degree is part of the problem with the conflict between the big world religions, is that, mine is right and yours is wrong. So she was used partly, her beliefs were used partly gently to explore that, but perhaps more, it was this idea that a sort of spiritual hunger is part of being human. That even if, which isn't to say that that you can't be atheist or and you know, atheists can also have spiritual hunger, but there is obviously something, I think, in the human psyche that needs something, and in her case it's the belief in the elder mother in the tree. In many people's cases it's religion, but whatever label you put on it, Cat was used to explore the idea really that part of the human condition is looking for something outside of ourselves, whatever form that may be found in. And it may be that it's, sorry, it may be that it's, you know, walking up a mountain or going to the sea and sort of just glorying in that, in nature. It may be nothing more than that, but there is a compulsion to look outside of ourselves, I think, and that was what she was representing.
It's very interesting as well, the idea that religion has been banned in your world because it has led to some giant war, which we're only told that on consequences. But it's why the community life is cut off from the rest. They're sifting through. The only job that anyone gets is data processing, where you sift through the records of the deceased. It's reasonably bleak vision of the future. But again, perhaps no more bleak than the 6 o'clock news half the time.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the authority is very distant. So there's drones that come by and drop goods off. But it's not an authoritarian state like 1984 or no. A kind of The Handmaid's Tale or something like that. It's always the idea that you don't want to upset authority, and they're very worried that they hear about somebody coming and talking about God, then there'll be consequences. It's not a traditional sort of totalitarian society that you've built up here. So how did you come up with your vision of the future? How did you imagine what it might all look like?
Well, the place itself is based on somewhere just up the road, actually, where there is just a line of cottages on one side of the road, and it's beneath the Preseli Hills. So the actual sort of visual image was from that. We take the dogs there walking, but more generally, I was more interested in exploring the relationships between the people in this village without it being diluted by too much interference or too many characters from the outside. I mean, obviously there's the one guy that turns up after the religious activity's been reported, and then towards the end another guy turns up very briefly, but I started from the premise that I wanted a very claustrophobic village environment where everything that happened really as a result of the people in that village. I didn't want events to be affected by what went on outside the village. So I sort of started from the inside and you know, and only went as far as the boundary, well, the hills are the boundary, basically.
And it is a novel about village life in a way, and about people knowing each other's business, and the sort of the rumours and the jealousy and the frustrations of all of that. And a big deal in the novel is that people can't have children, or very few children are born, but then mysteriously women start falling pregnant in the story, one of the uncanny happenings. And it's a brilliant novel as well for, you know, the minor characters' role really realised and believable, and their interactions. And it feels like a living community. And it feels, again, I think one of the great achievements of it is the way that you escalate the drama. So it's, as I say, lots of it is very, very funny. And it is a kind of a darkly comic novel of small town frustrations, and a way in which this mysterious stranger becomes a conduit for those frustrations and a way of changing things. But then as the novel goes on, it does get harsher and harsher, in the sense that it becomes clear that they are expecting the end of the world. And generally speaking, you may want to say what your research discovered about this, end of the world cults don't tend to end very well, it's fair to say.
Well, I think end of the world cults don't tend to end, I think, is it rather than not ending very well. Yes, there's a section I'll read just a little bit in a sec, but it reflects what happens often in religions that are what's called millenarian in nature, which means that so basically they think Judgment Day is literally about to happen within their lifetimes. Judgment Day I'm using as a loose term, but basically the end of the world as we know it is going to happen, and then there'll be a new world order where the faithful will be sort of raised up, if not actually physically raised up, but we will no longer have to worry about food or housing or whatever. And there are some terrible examples in real life. So the Jehovah's Witnesses Jehovah's Witnesses have announced the end of the world so many times, multiple times. But in 1920, or in the run up to 1925, the people who, the two guys that ran the Jehovah's, were leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses back then, announced that this was definitely the date. It was about the 10th date that had been announced, but it was definitely the date in 1925. And so many Jehovah's Witnesses sold their houses, resigned from their jobs, or sold their businesses, sold all their possessions, because they believed that the end of the world was about to, or the end of the world as they knew it was about to happen, and they would have no need of these worldly goods anymore. And they were left destitute. That the end of the world clearly didn't happen, and they were left destitute, and it was just awful. And then much more recently, there was another example in 1956, I think, and it was a much smaller group, one that would be called a cult, even though, I think cults really are religions, but and they mixed up sort of God with aliens, and they thought spaceships were going to come down on the 21st of December 1956 and take them away. And again, people sold their houses, left their jobs. One young woman was a student, and she was really close to graduating from university, and she just dropped out. And it's terrible what happens. And I reflected that in the Book of Jem, actually in some respects, in a, well, perhaps not as terrible a way even as some of those examples, but shall I read the little bit that,
yes,
it's a short extract. So this is another Eileen chapter, and everyone, all of God's threads are standing around in their binding area, basically listening to Jem, having a sort of a service, I suppose. And two individuals and their sons, so Cameron and Amber and their two sons, turn up and say, "We're ready to be bound," meaning that they're ready to join God's threads. And this is what transpires. Jem took Cameron and Amber by the hand and led them to the back of the platform. They had always been an unpleasantly pale family, and standing next to Jem, it was apparent they were also unnecessarily tall. The heat clearly didn't suit them because they were all very pink and damp. Farming was an odd choice of profession for people so ill-suited to being outdoors. Amber cleared her throat, and I had a horrible thought that there might be another baby announcement. There had better not be. It was definitely my turn next. "We are ready to be bound," Amber said, and Cameron and the boys nodded their huge heads, sweat flicking from their bright yellow hair in all directions. "In preparation for cleansing and renewal, we have killed all our animals. God will provide." "We cut their throats," Cameron added, "so they would have a thread of red around their necks, and God would bind them to itself. Then we burned them." No wonder I thought I could smell meat cooking. No one else appeared to be thinking about that, though. All the unbound on the other side of the ropes began shouting and screaming about how we were going to starve to death, but I didn't pay any attention to them because I was watching Jem. She lifted Cameron and Amber's hands, huge dirty farmer's hands bursting with knuckles, to her lips and kissed them, running her mouth back and forth between them like their fingers were made of silk. I shivered. Then she raised her head. "Our binding is strengthened by your action," she called, ignoring the racket coming from outside the ropes. God sees your faith and will reward you. After renewal, you will be among the threads that bind all other threads. God will see your faith and it will raise you up. This was our cue, and we started chanting, the threads abound, the threads abound, the threads abound. We called faster and faster, clapping in time with the words. Willow and Leah wrapped their arms over their stomachs, swaying from side to side. Laurel and Lorne jiggled Myla and Stone up and down. Cam and Amber, dull and stupid, had dropped to their knees on the platform so Jem could thread them. Once the red string was tied around their necks, they kissed the end of Jem's scarf, then stretched their pale arms up towards the sky, sobbing. Someone started stamping their feet and we all joined in. With each stamp, we kicked up dust and it swirled around our legs so we looked like we were floating above the earth. The threads abound, the threads abound, the threads abound. The clapping got faster, our feet hit the ground, the smell of burning meat drifted across the hillside, and still we chanted on and on, our voices so loud that we drowned out the terrified cries of the people outside the binding area.
Wow, yeah, scary stuff indeed.
But the point of that really is that Cameron and Amber have, I guess, the biggest cattle farm, let's say, in the area, and the village absolutely relies on them for meat. And as a sort of, I suppose, sacrifice to prove that they're ready to join God's thread, they've killed all their animals. So there's a genuine threat now of starvation. Also, in another part, the people who are bound, who are God's threads, are refusing to help gather the crops. But these things happen in real life. So,
yeah. And I suppose the other fascinating idea is what happens after the end of the world. Do people suddenly think, what have I been doing all these years? I've wasted my life. Or do they double down on the myth and think somehow, no, we got the date wrong, or there's some other way of explaining it or interpreting it? I mean, it's something similar happening with sort of Trump supporters. There was all the Q conspiracy was that Biden was going to be was never going to become president. He was going to be taken to Guantanamo Bay and hung. That Trump would remain president. He would arrest all the paedophile gang. And then when it didn't happen, there was a question: well, how do people respond to that? Do they accept that they were wrong, or do they somehow come up with a new narrative to explain things?
Well, sociologists would call it cognitive dissonance, and it was so the people who believed that the flying saucer were going to come and collect them, their group was I guess infiltrated by a university professor in Chicago and a couple of his graduate students, because he predicted that in that situation where you think the end of the world is going to happen and then it doesn't happen, in that situation, he said what would happen is quite a few people, a big proportion of people, of followers, if you like, would double down is the language, isn't it? Would actually, in order to sort of mentally make sense of believing something that hasn't happened, they would then redouble their efforts to make it happen. And that is indeed what happens, what happened to those people who, so the flying saucer did not arrive. A couple of people thought, maybe actually we've been conned here and the flying saucer's never going to arrive. Others thought, we obviously haven't done well enough in our preparations for the flying saucer. That's why it's not come. And so the Mormons, there was a big scandal around one part of the Mormons, the fundamentalist Church of the Latter-day Saints, around the turn of the millennium, where the guy who was in charge at that point, Rulon Jeffs, I think his name was, he said, right, okay, the end of the world basically is going to happen at year 2000. And so unmarried young women, if they're not married, they will essentially go to hell, is what he told everyone in the fundamentalist Church of the Latter-day Saints. And so it gave carte blanche for as many men as they wanted to go around rounding up basically prepubescent girls and marrying them, because this is the sect that believes in plural marriage. And then when the prophesied thing did not occur in the year 2000, there was this great sort of rending of clothes where people said, well, obviously we didn't do enough. It was our fault that the end of the world hasn't happened, and you know, we must do more. And that is what happens in real life, astonishing though it is. But that's how these religions, you know, they might not understand the sort of sociological reasons for it, but that's how, you know, they continue. That's how come the Jehovah's Witnesses have prophesied the end of the world dozens of times, and yet still people believe.
Yeah. No, fascinating material. And of course, you researched all that for the PhD. I suddenly realized time is racing along. So I think we need to turn to other people's questions who've been kind enough to send them in. So if you've got any more questions, feel free to type it into the Q&A. Right, the first question comes from Gaynor, and it's quite a tricky one to answer. You know, it begins, the final sentence of the novel is, and we don't want to give anything away about the ending, but the final sentence of the novel is, and I know God is coming. I suppose, and Gaynor's question is, the character who writes this, what does she think is going to happen next? And if you had to write another chapter, what do you think would happen to the group, to Underhill, to the characters next?
Well, I think the character that writes it, it's clear that she believes what she's written. So I think she thinks that God will come. As far as me, I think that's a more difficult question to answer. I'm kind of the in the school of thought that once books are out there, it's for people to make up their own minds as to what happens afterwards. I also, as I said earlier, I was very keen not to be cynical about religion in this book. And so for me to answer that question truthfully, I would have to say whether or not I believed God ever could come. And I'm not sure that that's I think it will be okay. I think Willow will have her baby and come home. And I think most of the characters will probably continue as they were. But I think the character that wrote the final line of the book, I don't think she'll be seen again. Okay.
Have you found the end of the book to be controversial? I mean, lots of people have been talking about the ending, and people who've read the novel. The ending is quite shocking, or seems it does that thing that all writers want it to do. And it comes as a surprise, but it also feels inevitable. And that's a lovely thing to be able to pull off. Did you always know how the novel was going to end?
I did. My first unpublished novel, I agonized for what felt like a lifetime trying to figure out how to pull all the various threads together and make it work. This one, though, I knew from very early on what was going to happen. And then, pleasingly, the more research I did for the purposes of the book and the PhD, the more I realized that actually it made sense. It really was inevitable, and that the ending absolutely could happen in the real world, I think. So it felt then that it was an ending that could work. But yes, I knew almost from the beginning how it was going to end.
Okay, well, if only we could talk more about the ending, but we better not, otherwise we'll be into big trouble. So let me go through. Claire has asked you a question about whether you believed that Jem was touched by God. But again, I think we probably are saying that we don't want to answer that, because that will change how you read the novel. So it's a lovely question, Claire, but maybe we will pass over that. Alex is asking you, which section did you enjoy writing the most, Kat's or Eileen's?
Eileen's. In fact, at times it worried me that maybe I have like a hidden Eileen inside me. I absolutely loved writing Eileen. I think partly because the more the humor of Eileen, I just really enjoyed. I found it relatively straightforward each time I sat down to write an Eileen chapter, to put myself back inside her head and try and see the world through her eyes. And there's the ridiculous scene where she's sort of been sick, and then she's watching some people a couple have sex and stuff like that. And never in a million years would I do something like that, but I loved enjoying. I mean, I enjoyed so much the writing of it. I think it just felt like real escapism, and that's why it was difficult to answer your question, Alan, about whether she's a monster, because I did I felt some affinity with her. I think maybe just
your inner Eileen.
Yeah. So it was definitely Eileen. I felt, although I felt Kat was much more like me, so I didn't find it difficult to imagine what Kat would, or how she would or wouldn't respond to things. But in terms of enjoyment, I just used to relish the idea of sitting down and writing another Eileen chapter. And when I finished, I missed writing an Eileen chapter.
I miss Eileen. I like to think she's still up there, lingering outside the window. And again, it's the fact that she's always gets everything wrong. It's always the way people respond to her. The way she then describes it. You know what's really going on, but it's always that she misreads every situation, which is the pleasure of it. Alex also asked, was this a novel that was always going to be written from a female point of view? And was that very important to the book?
Yes, I like that question. Yes. See, now there's very few charismatic leaders that are women. There are some. I mean, in terms of charismatic leaders of religions and cults, there are some. There's very few. So actually, if I wanted to be true to what would be likely, it would be more likely it would be a man. But the first novel that I wrote, mainly the characters were men, and it was I had some of it workshopped as part of the master's degree that I did. And somebody pointed out to me that almost all my characters were men. And until that moment, I had never realized that it was like an unconscious bias that I would pick a character and decide it was going to have to be a man. And so once I finished that novel and set about writing this novel, I was absolutely determined that all my main characters pretty much were going to be women. And it was really important to me that I did that. And I'm so pleased that I did. I think it adds something to certainly the fact that Jem's a woman. And I think Kat and Eileen, I liked the symmetry of two women sort of alternating their chapters. But yes, it was both deliberate but actually very important as a kind of redressing the balance of a bias I didn't realize I had till somebody pointed it out.
That's really interesting. Thank you. A question from anonymous attendee: which writers influenced the book, or which writers have influenced you the most in your own writing?
Well, probably it won't be any surprise to hear me say Margaret Atwood. I love Margaret Atwood. This book in particular, Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is about again, a speculative fiction novel, with sort of the cloning of actually, I won't say in case people haven't read it, but anyway, it's very different from this novel, but certainly that was an influence. And the biggest influence was actually a Philip Pullman book, which is called The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. I think that's right. And very, very small. It's only about 70 pages. And in it, he imagines that Christ and Jesus were twin brothers. And whilst one of them, I think Jesus is the one that sort of goes about doing the things that Jesus does, Christ is urged by an anonymous person to make a record of what Jesus does. And I was very influenced by that when it came to imagining Eileen's Book of Jem. It's a great book.
Okay, thank you very much. Question from Louis: is your next novel also based in the future?
Oh, now that's, yes. So I've just finished the first draft of my next novel. No is the answer, but it's based in a world, well, it starts off based in our world, entirely in our world, very realist, and then over time it diverges. So I am still sticking with the not quite the real world sort of theme, but it's not set in the future. In fact, it finishes in 2021. So no, it's not set in the future, but it's also not set entirely in reality.
Very mysterious. I like it. Absolutely. Another question. Do you have an intended or an imagined reader when you write? Do you have a kind of a perfect reader for your book?
Alan, you are my reader.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
No, I don't think I do, actually. I think I find it amazing that anyone wants to read it at all, to be honest. So
not at all, no.
No, so I don't. But I do find so the answer is no. But part of the reason I did a PhD and then before that master's, I do find writing without thinking there's anybody going to read it at all very difficult. So part of the reason I did a PhD was so that you would be my reader, Alan, because actually knowing that somebody is going to read it really motivates me. The idea of sitting at a desk writing something that might never be read by anyone, I find very demoralizing. So I don't have a specific reader in mind, but I'm hugely helped when I know that there is a reader, no matter who it is.
Well, luckily you've got a large number of appreciative readers typing in questions to this, and maybe as a final quote from the audience, this is from Jennifer. So it's not a question, but she'd just like to say how much she's been impressed by tonight. You're such a brilliant and fascinating thinker. I'm delighted to be able to attend this, a really interesting discussion, and I love the book.
Oh, thank you.
That's the kind of reader response that we're looking for, isn't it?
Oh, that's just wonderful. Thank you. Given this was my first ever one of these, that's great.
No, well, thank you. Well, I know, considering it's your first ever, a lovely, erudite, thoughtful, imaginative answers to all these questions. So thank you very much, Carole. I'd also like to stress that the Book of Jem is available. There's my copy. Here we go. From Watermark Press. Look, we'll hold them up. www.watermarkpress.co.uk if you want to order direct from the website. It's on the chat if you want to find the link. Please support Carole. If you haven't read the novel yet, it's a brilliant book. It's funny, it's dark, it's thoughtful, it's wholly original. There's nothing at all like it out there. So please support it. And thank you to everyone who's attended this evening's soiree. Thank you, as always, to Eileen and Matt from the Cultural Institute for hosting this and pressing all the right buttons and keeping us on the air. And of course, special thanks to Carole for such a fascinating discussion and for writing such a brilliant novel. So thank you, Carole.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, that's it all. Let me just check. There's upcoming events. The next will I'll be talking to Jane Fraser about her much anticipated debut novel, Advent, and that is coming up in just a couple of weeks' time. Also, if you do have the time and fancy pressing some more buttons, there is a short event survey form. Please press this button or Eileen will be lurking outside your window tonight. Otherwise, thank you very much. Our time here is done. Thank you again to Carole. Thank you all for tuning in. Good night.